Your silent suffering ended the exact moment you stopped looking for answers from someone who only offered you endless doubt. You clung to ghosts, waiting for a random message to rebuild what was already shattered, bleeding out your dignity for a sliver of attention. The real transformation ignited when you finally accepted that your pain required no validation from the person who inflicted it. You gave up the exhausting need to explain yourself, and in doing so, you took back absolute control of your reality. This was the turning point where your absence began to resonate with a devastating force, completely tearing down the dynamic that kept you captive for so long. The natural impulse after being discarded is the desperate urge to prove your worth, to parade your victories, and to weaponize your self-improvement to strike back at the one who underestimated you. You want her to witness what she lost, hoping she feels the exact sting she left in your chest. This defense mechanism is born entirely from a wounded ego, frantically trying to regain lost ground through loud displays and calculated spectacles. But operating under this bitter resentment only proves that she remains the absolute master of your actions. Your supposed evolution is just a theatrical performance designed for an audience of one, keeping you chained to the toxicity you claim to hate. True elevation is never announced with fanfares, nor is it ever used as a petty instrument of retaliation. Much like a deeply rooted tree that solidifies its foundation in the dark while enduring the harshest winters, genuine growth is an intimate, quiet process that demands zero external applause. When you channel your agony into raw discipline without broadcasting it to the world, you utterly disorient those who expected to see you beg. This type of silent fortitude severs the narcissistic supply they secretly craved. Your refusal to participate in the drama destroys the predictable script they had confidently written for your inevitable emotional collapse. The shift happens when you redirect that raw, bleeding energy inward, not to punish her departure, but to brutally honor your own existence. You start building a resilient body, a sharper mind, and unbreakable boundaries, solely because you finally remembered your own inherent value. This radical change in trajectory generates an undeniable gravitational pull. The ultimate irony is that the precise second you stop desiring her gaze is exactly when your new composure becomes impossible for her to ignore. You have liberated yourself from the heavy chains of her approval, moving with a quiet authority that makes you completely unreachable to those who once thought they could play you. Surrendering your vital energy to someone who only borrows it leaves you hollow, exhausted, and operating in a perpetual emotional deficit. You poured your attention, your irreplaceable time, and your fierce loyalty into a bottomless pit, naively trusting that your constant sacrifice would eventually be rewarded with genuine devotion. This parasitic imbalance eroded you from the inside out, blinding you to your own ambitions and slowly erasing your identity. You tolerated the agonizing lack of reciprocity because the paralyzing fear of loss convinced you that overgiving was your only survival tactic. Feeding someone else's comfort while starving your own peace is the definition of self-betrayal. Authentic power has always been found in the ability to retain and master your vital energy, not in bleeding it out for those who refuse to match your effort. Imagine your focus as a sacred blazing fire in the dead of winter. If you let anyone walk up and warm their hands without ever adding a single log, you will inevitably freeze to death in the dark. When you finally stop making excuses for her absence and cease trying to prove a worth she refuses to see, you reclaim total dominion over your inner territory. This silent withdrawal is not a tantrum or a manipulative punishment. It is the absolute reclamation of your personal sovereignty and a declaration of your unyielding self-respect. Reclaiming your power means you stop reacting to her suffocating inconsistency and start aggressively mastering your own responses. You're no longer available to initiate contact, to play the convenient emotional lifesaver, or to bend your reality around her intermittent whims. You evolve into the ruthless guardian of your internal fire, protecting it and utilizing it exclusively for your own relentless expansion. In this state of deliberate detachment, she finally feels the freezing darkness left by the absence of your light. You do not need to demand respect. Your unwavering, peaceful retreat sets a non-negotiable standard, proving that your presence is a highly exclusive privilege. Your emotional predictability reduced you to a mere pawn in someone else's psychological game. By constantly showing your cards, responding immediately to every breadcrumb, and letting your deepest frustrations bleed onto your face, you handed over a detailed map of your vulnerabilities. She knew exactly which buttons to press to extract a reaction, granting her a constant, intoxicating sense of superiority and control over the dynamic. This setup absolved her of any real effort, knowing you were always desperate to repair whatever she carelessly broke. Your unconditional, predictable loyalty erased all mystery, giving her the false certainty that you would endlessly wait in the shadows. When you abruptly sever the supply of predictable reactions, you deeply destabilize the person who fed on your emotional availability. It is equivalent to a general who, in the heat of battle, suddenly shifts every formation, leaving the opponent swinging wildly at phantoms. Your firm silence and absolute non-reaction manufacture a suffocating vacuum for the ego that was entirely accustomed to dominating you. She can no longer use your outbursts or your pathetic pleas to measure her own worth or secure her high ground in your life. This sudden sensory deprivation plunges her into a paralyzing uncertainty. Your desperate need to find peace within chaos is replaced by an impenetrable calm. The ultimate resolution is found when you take back the reins in 100 small, silent moments, deliberately choosing stillness over pointless conflict. You realize that your mind is an impregnable fortress, and you outright refuse to hand the keys over to external chaos. You stop trying to decipher or alter her behavior, focusing the entirety of your will on mastering your own. This elevated level of self-authority acts as an unforgiving mirror, reflecting the permanent loss of the power she once held over you. Your silence is no longer an empty void, it transforms into a tangible, dominant force. You have ceased needing to be understood by someone who never actually wanted to listen. Operating as an unconditional safety net for someone who treats you like an afterthought is a direct insult to your own dignity. You allowed your entire existence to orbit her needs, willingly acting as the emotional crash pad that absorbed all her falls, even when she was the one actively pushing you off the ledge. This blind devotion built a delusion in her mind that your presence was a guaranteed infinite resource. However, playing this role of the perpetual caretaker drained you dry, wearing down your spirit while she moved forward without a single glance backward. Accustomed to your endless support, she developed a fatal blindness to your actual value, assuming you lacked the spine to walk away. The impact of your genuine absence hits like a silent, devastating tidal wave. When the man who was always ready to sacrifice himself suddenly removes his support system without a word of warning, reality fractures for the one depending on that crutch. There are no dramatic arguments or bitter complaints, only a profound, terrifying peace that swiftly replaces the old desperate attachment. This absolute detachment strips away her comfortable illusion, abruptly forcing her into the freezing cold of her own selfish decisions. The sudden withdrawal of your constant warmth forces her to confront the massive territory you once occupied. The facade of indifference crumbles under the weight of your newly found resolve. Your true evolution requires anchoring your energy deep within your own core, refusing to ever again be dragged out to sea by someone else's unpredictable tides. Her silence no longer shakes you, and the sound of her name no longer triggers a spiral because you have transcended the pathetic need to survive on emotional leftovers. You march forward with your eyes locked on your own horizon, allowing fleeting emotions to shatter like waves against an immovable cliff. By freeing yourself from the desperate urge to prove your worth, you morph into a magnetic, unsolvable enigma. You vanish from her radar not driven by bleeding wounds, but guided by a supreme, unshakable purpose that she can never comprehend. Silent consistency is tragically and fatally confused with unconditional permanence. You operated as an invisible force holding her world in perfect equilibrium, offering undivided attention, fierce loyalty, and steady support without demanding a single thing in return. But this extreme generosity manufactured an environment where your presence was violently devalued, treated as a basic entitlement rather than an incredibly rare privilege. By refusing to make noise or aggressively claim the respect you earned, you trained her to take from you with zero intention of ever giving back. This parasitic dynamic reduced your profound essence to mere background noise, hiding your massive worth behind your constant availability. The sheer magnitude of a load-bearing pillar is only truly understood the exact moment it is violently ripped away and the entire structure begins to collapse. The very second, your protective energy and care vanished. The emotional space you used to occupy started emitting a deafening, inescapable echo. She began to feel the crushing weight of your absence in the dead silence of her mornings, in the quiet of her phone, and in the sudden, jarring instability of her daily routine. She collided face first with the colossal void created by your retreat, a void that swallowed not just emotional support, but the foundational security she took for granted. Your silence destroys more illusions than 1,000 arguments. Deep inner mastery dictates that you must immediately stop debating your worth and start embodying it through absolute, unyielding action. You withdraw with flawless dignity, sparing the world your outrage or your ultimatums, simply ceasing to pour your vital water into barren soil. You finally understand that your value does not need to be screamed from the rooftops. It strikes with devastating lethal force when it transforms into total absence. You leave behind a territory that only those capable of genuine reciprocation are worthy to enter, heavily armoring your life against emotional parasites. This irreversible departure is not a petty revenge tactic, but a monumental masterclass in self-respect. Clinging to the pathetic hope of an unlikely change is a form of self-inflicted torture that keeps you chained to a rotting past. You remained endlessly available, patiently orbiting the very edges of her life, delusionally convinced that your unbreakable loyalty would eventually trigger a grand awakening in her. This submissive, compliant posture only reinforced her absolute supremacy over you, confirming that she could wander away and return without facing a single consequence. While you put your own brutal evolution on hold, waiting for her to magically see your worth, you actively degraded your own time and energy. This permanent availability acted as a heavy iron anchor, dragging you into the abyss of dependency. When you violently elevate yourself above these pathetic old patterns and sever the supply of your attention, you become unreachable in a deeply mental and spiritual sense. This is not about the petty act of blocking a number. It is a radical shift in frequency that places you entirely out of her emotional striking distance. This sudden inaccessibility shatters the framework of someone who was highly addicted to playing with your expectations. Realizing you are no longer lurking in the shadows, begging to settle for the scraps of her affection, induces a devastating psychological vertigo. She realizes the man she treated as a guaranteed backup option has ascended to a level of autonomy she can no longer touch. Authentic detachment is never born from a boiling cauldron of resentment, but from a glacial, unbreakable clarity. You firmly recognize that your mental peace is your supreme, non-negotiable responsibility, and you categorically refuse to act as a dumping ground for her whims or midnight identity crises. By dropping everything that falls outside your direct control, you conquer the only absolute freedom that matters. You close that chapter not with burning fury, but with the majestic, terrifying indifference of a man who has discovered a far greater purpose. You become completely unreachable not to punish her, but because you have risen to a dimension of self-respect where her validation is utterly meaningless. Allowing external actions to dictate your internal state is voluntarily handing the steering wheel of your life over to a passing storm. There was a time when a deliberately delayed text, a cold shoulder, or a vague, manipulative signal was more than enough to plunge you into crippling anxiety and destructive overthinking. She knew this specific vulnerability intimately, weaponizing it to pull your invisible strings, extracting sick validation from your panic and your desperate, pathetic attempts to fix things. This emotional tyranny kept you operating entirely out of a primal fear of abandonment, forcing you to react compulsively to every tiny crumb she threw. You were a hostage in the theater of her insecurities. Stripping someone of their power to alter your pulse is the most lethal psychological strike you can execute. When her passive-aggressive games, calculated silences, and desperate attempts at provocation crash into the titanium wall of your serene indifference, the entire power dynamic disintegrates into dust. You no longer jump at her command or crumble when she pulls away. This ironclad, calculated restraint plunges her into absolute chaos, violently ripping away the tactical advantage she smugly relied on. Seeing that your emotions are no longer a playground she can conquer or manipulate, she is slammed with the crushing reality of her own irrelevance in your new mental ecosystem. Your calm is her ultimate torment. Transforming yourself into the impenetrable architect of your inner world demands that you permanently stop treating the emotions of others as your personal emergencies. You construct boundaries of forged steel, not to cower from the world, but to systematically reject the poison others try to inject into your veins. You observe the provocations without absorbing a single drop, letting them pass like a weak breeze through ancient ruins. You have violently revoked the access keys you once handed to temporary visitors, consolidating absolute mental sovereignty. This unshakable composure is not a fake, fragile shell. It is the raw embodiment of an internal empire that requires zero validation to dominate its reality. The human ego is a loud, fragile machine entirely designed to manufacture pathetic excuses that shield the psyche from the brutal pain of loss. Initially, she barricaded herself behind a thick wall of sheer arrogance, brainwashing herself into believing you were the ultimate loser and that your desperate return was a guaranteed certainty. These delusional stories functioned as a cheap painkiller, filling the deafening silence with superficial noise and the fake illusion of absolute control. As long as the ego dictated the narrative, your departure wasn't processed as a massive loss, but as a minor, temporary glitch in a game she was certain she was winning. But this shield of supreme arrogance is fatally unsustainable. When the cheap distractions burn out and the ego inevitably collapses under its own massive delusion, the only thing left standing is a terrifying bottomless abyss. It is in the brutal, unfiltered reality of the night, far away from the applause of the crowd, that the sheer magnitude of the space you vacated strikes with lethal precision. The very silence she once weaponized against you now turns feral, aggressively amplifying the depth of her own severe lack. She realizes it wasn't just your mere company that kept her stable, but the heavy density of your essence and the unyielding spine of your character. This agonizingly late revelation obliterates her narcissistic narrative, exposing the catastrophic size of her error. When facing the total collapse of someone else's delusions, your only job is to stand perfectly still and let the crushing gravitational weight of reality finish the job. You do not intervene, you do not correct the record, and you absolutely do not attempt to catch her as she falls. You simply watch with the cold, detached gaze of a man who understands the unforgiving nature of consequences. You allow her to face the brutal isolation of having completely underestimated the rare value of what was standing right in front of her. Her inevitable regret is not fuel for your ego, but the undeniable hard proof that you chose the right path when you walked away. Let the silent passage of time humiliate the arrogance that tried to break you. The desperate hunger for dramatic closure is a deep sickness in modern psychology. She anticipated, with almost mathematical certainty, a final text bleeding with sorrow, a bitter confrontation, or at the very least, a passive-aggressive social media post confirming she still held power over your mind. This anticipated reaction would have fed her insatiable need to feel crucial, handing her the perfect opportunity to reject you one last time or keep you trapped in a pathetic cycle of mutual validation. By waiting for your emotional detonation, she positioned herself to play the untouchable prize, dictating the final terms of your demise. Open conflict was the emotional safety net she relied on to avoid facing her own guilt. The complete and absolute absence of a reaction generates a feedback vacuum that mentally breaks a mind accustomed to thriving on chaotic drama. When you violently robbed her of the opportunity for a predictable closure, you abandoned her alone with the crushing, suffocating weight of her own toxic choices. Your iron refusal to send that pathetic, desperate message or beg for empty explanations functioned as a brutal rear-view mirror, forcing her to stare at the wreckage she created. That silence was not a petty, passive-aggressive jab. It was a lethal tactical retreat that stripped the battlefield of all unnecessary noise, exposing the raw ugliness of her behavior. You turned her expectation of supremacy into a pit of regret. Your most monumental victory is forged in the understanding that true, terrifying power is demonstrated through ironclad restraint, never through the reckless bleeding of your wounds. You chose absolute composure over cheap, fleeting catharsis, fully internalizing that forcing a dead connection only exposes your own pathetic weakness. You completely stopped trying to sculpt her warped perception of you, allowing the heavy, suffocating echo of your absence to deliver the final devastating blow. This graveyard silence, deeply rooted in your unyielding self-respect, told her absolutely everything she needed to hear without you wasting a single breath. You chose yourself with such violent finality that the need for a last word evaporated, burning your vital emotional reserves in a desperate attempt to resuscitate a bond that only you were fighting for is a war destined for total, humiliating defeat. For far too long, you squandered an ungodly amount of energy trying to decode her shifting moods, making excuses for her icy withdrawals, and painfully contorting yourself to fit into the microscopic spaces she allowed you. You willingly swallowed degrading conditions, high on the delusional hope that your relentless bleeding devotion would finally cure her blindness. But this superhuman effort did nothing but erode your backbone and loudly broadcast your desperate dependency. You were the sole architect of your own misery by building your life on her absolute apathy. The ultimate brutal irony of detachment is that the entire power dynamic flips with violent force the exact microsecond you completely surrender the outcome. While you have scorched the earth of your past pain and marched forward to aggressively rebuild your internal empire, she is the one now securely trapped in the suffocating labyrinth of memory. She sifts through the ashes of the past, secretly starving for the unbreakable devotion she arrogantly discarded when she held it in her hands. The ruthless, piercing clarity you have achieved stands in stark, humiliating contrast to the chaos now consuming her. Your relentless evolution sentences her to be the silent spectator of your massive, unstoppable ascent. The absolute mastery of letting go demands that you ruthlessly concentrate every ounce of your life force into cultivating an unbreakable, supreme purpose. You no longer chain yourself to the rotting corpse of what could have been, nor do you harbor a toxic, boiling resentment that keeps your mind enslaved to the past. You have finally realized that your intrinsic, massive worth is completely immune to the pathetic fluctuations of someone else's flawed judgment. You breach this new chapter with a razor-sharp mind and a heavily armored core, where the weak desire to be missed has been completely annihilated. You align flawlessly with your own internal compass, advancing with a cold, magnetic authority that nothing can stop. The true sovereignty of a man is never measured by his pathetic ability to beg those who want to leave to stay, but by his unshakable strength to cut loose anything that threatens his momentum. When the agonizing sting of rejection is brutally transmuted into fierce discipline and deafening silence, you cease being a victim and become the ruthless architect of your own reality. Her departure was the explosive catalyst you needed to remember the colossal scale of your own power. Do not look back. The ascent to greatness requires you to travel light, completely unburdened by the heavy chains of external approval. If this brutal truth has ignited the fire of your purpose, subscribe to the channel and prepare to absolutely dominate your existence.